Hey guys, it's Danny. Today we're gonna talk about flushing orchid pots. I'm gonna show you how I like to do it, but also explain why, and more than that, show you the actual side effects of not flushing. Throughout my videos, I did mention about flushing, but in my latest How I Fertilize Orchids video, which if you missed, check it down below, I will share it with you, I mentioned that I like to flush through soaking. So today I'm gonna explain why, and because I know some of you are in a hurry, first I'm gonna start with just showing you how I do it. Alrighty, I have my guinea pig here. Flushing is the same for pretty much all of my setups, well of course Vandas because they're bare-rooted. Either if it's the terrestrial mix or organic mix, either it's the Leca, I flush in the same way, and I do so by using tap water. I have around 300 orchids, I think, and I cannot produce that much osmosis water, so I'm using my tap water, which is medium hard, has around 250 parts per million dissolved solids. It's okay for flushing, not all that okay in the long term. I prefer osmosis water. So I fill to the brim my self-watering pots. It's very easy to do this in the self-watering pots. And then I let it sit for at least 10 minutes or so. This works out just great for me because in the meantime, while they sit and soak, I can actually clean my little shelf, maybe inspect the orchid, remove a sheath or a dried leaf or something of the sorts. After 10 minutes or so, I just remove the orchid from the decorative container, let it drain a little bit, then dump this water, and I throw away all of it. You can see there's almost nothing left there. If there's a little bit, that's okay. Put the orchid back, and then refill my pot typically with fertilized water. In my instance right now, I don't have anything prepared, I just need a little bit of water, so I'm just gonna put osmosis water, and that's about it. So imagine I do this for all of my 300 orchids, or so, 250, 300, but in a more organized way. As I was saying, with the organic mixes that I have, I do the very same thing. Luckily, there aren't many orchids in organic media, so everything is pretty mess-free when it comes to flushing. So now that that's done, let's get to what I believe is the most important part of the video, the explanations. Why do we need to flush, why I flush the way I do, and so on and so forth. So you might have heard of this. Even some fertilizer companies suggest that you do run clean water, non-fertilized water through your pot once a month, once every 2 weeks, or from time to time to eliminate salt buildup. Pretty much that's the most common reason you will hear people talk about, and that is true. Fertilizer buildup can happen, and I do have a little bit to show you just so you know how it looks like. And there you go, as you can see, that white deposit on the Leca, that is nothing more than fertilizer salts. The exact chemical formulation I cannot tell you, I'm not a chemist, I don't have a laboratory, but my suspicion is it must be some calcium. We'll get to that. Salt buildup can happen both in inorganic clay media, but also in organic. It doesn't really have any preference. Buildup will happen. In porous clay materials such as Leca, Ceramis, and even the clay pot, you will see this deposit more than you would in bark or sphagnum moss, because these materials suffer from a natural phenomenon called efflorescence. And I'll link you down below to the Wikipedia link if you want to learn more about efflorescence. And pretty much whatever salts are accumulated inside these beads will surface. No matter how small the quantity will be, it will be on the surface, so pretty much the entire quantity of salts in this pot is found at the surface. Efflorescence happens mainly in construction materials such as Leca, but also naturally in porous rock. Being that the organic mixes we use, whether they're bark, coconut husk, or sphagnum moss, they're not porous rocks. Therefore, they don't promote the efflorescence phenomenon, but they can still retain salt buildup within their structure. A piece of bark has layers, and even though you cannot compress it too much, in comparison to, let's say, Leca or even Ceramis, it's actually a lot softer. It can retain some water within it, especially coconut husk, but being that it does not produce efflorescence, the salts it accumulates do not surface. They stay inside in the structures. So with bark and sphagnum moss, you'll pretty much not see the buildup on the surface unless it's a little bit too much. The buildup will still be there though in the structures. For this reason, and for the reason that salts don't really dissolve in a second, I prefer to soak my pots, especially the organic media pots. In this way, I allow time for the minerals to completely dissolve in water, which can take 10 minutes. Just running water through the pot might not be enough time for them to properly dissolve. And also because I want to completely saturate the structure and the texture and the layers of this medium. I want water to infiltrate all of the levels of this medium because in my mind this is a much better flush. Now at this point you might be asking, okay, we understand why you need to flush the organic media pots, but what about the clay pots? You suggested that the vast majority of the salt buildup is on the surface, so just running water through the pot should be okay. And yes, typically it is, but through flushing we're not only eliminating salt buildup, and this is something I've rarely seen people talk about or articles talk about, but we're also eliminating organic debris. And I have some pictures to share with you. I recently repotted one of my dendrobiums and some of the older roots were decomposing, but surprise, surprise, because Leca is a hard sphere, when we try to compact it, we get another natural phenomenon happening, and this is the rules of the sphere packing. In between all of the Leca beads, there will always be a constant air pocket. Because Leca is not a soft material, we cannot compact it, pretty much it will always hold its shape. So the spaces in between the Leca, as long as they're not completely blocked by the roots, which doesn't really happen at least all that fast, we can have air movement. But not only air movement, water movement as well, and organic debris movement. In an organic setup, debris movement is impaired because pieces of bark, sphagnum moss, and all of those things, they're not regular. They do not abide to the same sphere packing rule. They're not even hard spheres. They don't have a determined shape. Therefore, the pockets in between them will not be symmetrical. Therefore, whatever organic debris we try to eliminate from between them will be a lot harder to achieve than in the Leca. As a side note, this is why we aim to cut away all of the dead roots when we're repotting orchids. We don't want those roots to decompose, get trapped in the medium, and then start to acidify the environment, retain water, and actually lead to a faster breaking down of organic medium. When it comes to Leca, not necessarily all inorganic mixes, but at least with Leca, which is sphere, this organic buildup is really not as severe, and it's actually really easy to remove, and I shall demonstrate. Let's presume I would only run water through this pot from above, pretty much get it at the sink and run some water over it. Yes, sure, I will get rid of some debris, but not as much because I am forcing that debris to go down. Not sideways, not up. So the paths of actually getting out of the pot are limited due to the way that I direct the debris. If I fill this pot with water, pretty much soak it, I fill the air pockets and pretty much the pathways with water. And so the debris has multiple directions in which it can travel. And as a result, I will do a much better flush, as I shall show you. There we go. This is what came out of this pot, and I hope you can see the amount of debris. This is just dead roots, and by me flushing, I am eliminating the dead velamen, all of this debris that is trapped. If I would just run water through the pot, I would not get the same result. In clay medium or inorganic media, organic debris such as dead roots are not necessarily all that detrimental, such as in the case of organic media. They will not lead to decomposition of the medium because, of course, clay does not decompose, so that worry is eliminated. However, it is my kind of life belief that everything good or harmless can become very bad if it's excessive. Therefore, I don't want to let this debris accumulate because it can still drop down the pH a lot, and even if it's not going to decompose my medium, it can actually clog all of those air pockets and spaces in between the Leca and maybe reduce the rate of ventilation and aeration of my roots. So obviously I want them out. So now that we know what flushing is and what we achieve with it, let's talk about why these salt buildups accumulate in the first place. Can we avoid them? Well, we can reduce them, I believe. We cannot completely avoid them because they really do depend on a lot of things. First of all, we cannot remove fertilizer from our regime because slowly but surely our orchids will deplete themselves. They need nutrients, minerals, all of that stuff we call food in order to grow, so we cannot completely eliminate the fertilizer. We can reduce it in accordance to our setups and our orchids, of course. If we don't over-fertilize, we have a better chance to have accumulations less often. However, even so, it's hard to tell which orchid will have more accumulations than other. Typically, a brand new potted orchid, which is not established, will not consume as much fertilizer as a completely established orchid. Also, an orchid which is in vegetative growth will consume more fertilizer than an orchid which is, let's say, resting, maybe in that winter dormancy, case in which they might not consume fertilizer at all. A medium which dries faster typically has more chances to have salt buildups because the time in which the fertilizer is available to the roots is in liquid form is restricted. When everything dries, the salts dry as well and the orchid cannot pick them up. So if it dries very fast, obviously it's more prone to having that fertilizer build up. So in this case, we can alternate plain water waterings with fertilizer waterings, pretty much redissolve the salts and make them again available for the orchid. And there are, of course, instances where we have orchids potted in the same time with the same growth rate and also similar orchids, one that has almost no buildup at all and one that does indeed have buildup. And in this case, most often than not, it has to do with the quantity of roots, such as in this case. These are two orchids that I potted almost at the same time. And if we take a look at the root system, we can see that this one in particular has more roots than this other one. Here we only have one root visible, I think, this one. And that's it. So the more roots you have, the more fertilizer the orchid will consume. It is pretty logical. The more root surface we have, the more fertilizer we can absorb. Typically, bigger orchids have bigger roots, so more root surface, but we can have, let's say, recovering orchids which don't have enough roots, such as in my case. They typically consume less fertilizer, and if we adjust fertilizer specifically for them, we can actually avoid some buildup, but in my opinion, buildup of a certain quantity is unavoidable. Thus, flushing, in my opinion, is actually really important for the health of the roots, because I didn't tell you what can happen if we let salts accumulate. Well, pretty much root damage and root burn. Now, here I'm gonna go into some, let's say, logical assumptions. Disclaimer, I'm not a chemist in any way, I'm just an enthusiast. So based on my research up until now and what I know, I drew some conclusions, but do take them with a grain of salt and do your research, of course, because at this point we're going into chemistry territory, which is not my territory. But anyway, let's begin. So roots can actually start to burn in contact with salts. And by the way, what you see here is a burn, but it wasn't created by me. This is how I received this orchid. I'm just showing it to you just to show you how it can look like. This is a pretty severe root burn, and I think you can see it better now. This is a burn of the velamen, but root tips are actually pretty sensitive to burning as well. And throughout last year, if you're a long-time subscriber, you know my hassle with that. Root tips are the most sensitive part of the root. They're tender and they can stop growing if the environment is too dry. Imagine that root tip coming in contact with a buildup, with some salt deposits. It will burn. Now, this burn, in my opinion, most often than not is caused by the hygroscopic nature of salts. What does that mean? Well, it pretty much means the tendency of salts to absorb the moisture and water in the air. Our minerals and orchid nutrients are hygroscopic as well. This is why we need to keep them in airtight containers. And you might know, if you've ever forgot the lid off, that at some point it can actually become really humid up to the point of becoming completely liquid if your environment is very, very humid. So let's think a little bit about this hygroscopic nature of salts and think that the buildup we have on our orchid pots is nothing more than the salts we use as fertilizer. Therefore, when they're not dissolved in water, they revert to the same properties they have in our little container of absorbing moisture. What are root tips full of? Moisture. So I believe that this so-called burn is nothing more than excessive dehydration of the root tip. The velamen is a little bit more strong than the root tip, yes, but it's not completely immune, and if salt is in such big quantity, it can dehydrate the velamen as well, and then the velamen can get infected. Usually a burnt root tip is blackened, that's why we called it burned. But because of my experience and what I went through this couple of years with root burns, I believe is just pretty much dehydration. Now that all sounds pretty scary, doesn't it? Well, it's not all that bad, because yet again, it is my experience and my suspicion, it's not proven, it is my suspicion that not all salts are as hygroscopic. I think some compounds are not so dangerous or water absorbent. And luckily, one of the compounds which is not so hygroscopic for us is calcium carbonate. Fertilizers, I think, typically contain calcium oxide, but calcium carbonate is found in tap water, and this is nothing more than chalk or limestone. If you've ever worked with chalk or limestone, you know it does get wet, it absorbs water, but not to the point of getting liquefied. I think there are other minerals which are a lot more absorbent, such as good old Epsom salts. Now this is a jar that I don't use all that much because I don't see deficiencies, but I did use at some point. As you can see, I'm trying to keep it as airtight as possible. I even have some silica gel in there, and still, look at this, it absorbed moisture, and it's yeah, it's already humid. If I leave the lid off, it will completely start to absorb the humidity in my grow space. And in my opinion, Epsom salt in this magnesium chemical form is a lot more hygroscopic than the calcium carbonate. And I don't only say this because I just have experience with chalk or something of the sorts. I do say this because in my previous winters, when obviously my orchids did not consume as much fertilizer, I forgot to mention, in colder temperatures, they consume less fertilizer. When the day is shorter again, they consume less fertilizer, so I'm more prone to having some buildup in the winter time. But being that I don't fertilize all that much, I think my orchids are actually consuming the vast majority of things that I give them, and the buildup that I have looks to me like it's calcium in nature. Epsom salt, if you notice, it's a little bit crystally, it reflects a little bit the light. This one doesn't, it's like, you know, it's like chalk. All winter long, the roots have grown in it and touched it, and nothing bad happened. And I think I talked about this last winter as well. However, if you remember 2 years ago, I experienced a lot of root burn. When I did that, I noticed that on the top of my medium, I had something very sparkly. Looked a little bit like Epsom salt, but of course, it could be something else. These salts all look different between them. It didn't appear to be calcium in nature. Now that burned my root tips. So it is my belief that not all of the salts are so hygroscopic and so damaging. And to me, this little buildup that you see here, and let me just give you a little close-up. Okay, so this thing, it's not sparkly. It actually kind of comes off a little bit on my finger here. This looks very much like calcium or chalk or whatever you want to call it. This stuff actually is not so detrimental to the orchid roots, at least in my experience. But again, I shall repeat it, it is my opinion and experience and my conclusions. And from here on, you're obviously free to research it yourself or share with me down below in the description in a comment your opinions. If you're a chemist, we would love to hear from you. And of course, based on the principle that everything which is good or harmless can become bad if it's excessive, I don't want to let any type of salt build up. Therefore, I want to be a lot more diligent in flushing my pots. I can do so easy right now. So once a month or so, I will go ahead and flush my orchids, even with tap water, because at some point the accumulations will be bigger than whatever the salt content is in my tap water. And in the end, I hope you've enjoyed the video. If you've always wondered why we flush, well, I hope this gave you some idea. And you know the drill. If you've enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up. If you hated it, give it a thumbs down. Subscribe to my channel for regular orchid videos, tutorials, experiments, and other fun orchid related topics. And if you like YouTube to notify you whenever I upload a new video, just turn on all notifications for my channel. And with that said, I'll see you guys tomorrow. Bye!